The morning started like any other until it didn't. The smell of butter and sugar filled the kitchen of Maple and Rye's bakery as I dusted powdered sugar over a tray of almond croissants. The sunlight stretched through the windows, hitting the copper mixers, and the old photo of my dad smiling beside the first oven we ever bought. I remember thinking it's a good day. Then my phone buzzed. I wiped my hands on my apron, checked the screen, and froze. The email subject line read Business Ownership Transfer. Confirmed. My stomach dropped. I opened it. My name was gone. Only 2 names remained: Nora Carter and Grace Carter, my mother and my sister. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, the scent of fresh bread suddenly sour. My fingers trembled, the email glowing like a betrayal in black and white. For a second, I thought it had to be a mistake. It wasn't. It was official. The bakery I built from nothing wasn't mine anymore. I stood there motionless as the ovens hummed behind me. The first customers were already forming a line outside, chatting, holding their coffee cups. They had no idea that the woman who'd spent 8 years kneading, burning, tasting, and perfecting everything behind that counter had just been erased. My throat tightened. I wiped the sugar off my hands, turned off the mixer, and walked to the office in the back. Every certificate, every recipe framed on the wall still had my name on it. Owner Lydia M. Carter. I printed the email, stared at the company header. The signatures, the timestamp. My mother's handwriting was easy to spot, even on the digital form, clean, precise, old-fashioned. Grace's e-signature sat next to it, looping and carefree. I felt heat crawl up my chest. My mother's note at the bottom read restructuring for efficiency. Lydia agrees to step down. I whispered to the empty room. Lydia didn't. I grabbed my phone and called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, cheerful, like she was expecting me. Sweetheart, I was going to call you later. Did you get the notice? The notice? My voice cracked. You mean the one saying you and Grace stole my company? She sighed, calm, patronizing. Oh, don't dramatize it, honey. We're just reorganizing. It's still the family's bakery. The family, I said. Or just the 2 of you, Lydia. She warned, that same tone she used when I was 10 and questioning her decisions. You've been stretched thin. Always anxious, controlling everything. Grace and I just thought you needed a break. A break, I repeated. You forged my signature and took my business. That's not a break, that's theft. Don't be so harsh. It's all for the family, she said softly. You'll thank us when you've had some rest. Then she hung up. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, long after the line went dead. My reflection in the glass door looked like a stranger flower on my cheek, eyes, wide hair pulled back in the same messy bun I'd worn since college. Behind me, the ovens beeped, reminding me the next batch was ready. I didn't move. When I finally stepped out to the front, Grace was there arranging pastries in the display case. She looked radiant, hair, curled nails, painted the kind of polished confidence that photographs well but feels hollow up close. Hey, you're here early, she said, as if nothing had happened. You knew, I said quietly. Her smile faltered, then returned. Knew what? Don't play dumb, Grace. The transfer. She straightened, eyes bright but cold. Oh, that. Look, it's not personal. Mom and I talked, things were getting tense. You were micromanaging everyone and it was affecting morale. Morale? I laughed softly. You mean you didn't like that I expected you to show up on time, Lydia? Come on, she said, lowering her voice. You're amazing at baking, but you're not exactly easy to work with. You scare people. You scared me sometimes. I stared at her, my own sister, who used to burn toast and cry about it when we were kids. I taught you everything you know about this place. You don't get to call me scary because I cared. She looked away, busying herself with the pastries. You're overreacting. It's just business. No, I said. It's my life. Customers began trickling in. Grace gave them her charming smile, that glossy facade she'd perfected for social media. Welcome to Maple and Rye, she sang, pretending everything was normal. I walked out the back door before I said something I couldn't take back. The cool morning air hit my face. Across the street, the reflection of the bakery shimmered in a puddle, bright sign, clean windows full of life. But it didn't feel alive anymore. Not without me. Driving home, my thoughts tangled with every sound of the city. Horns, footsteps, rain, starting to fall on the windshield. I tried to picture the moment it started going wrong, maybe when I let Grace handle social media, maybe when Mom offered to help with the paperwork. I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, but deep down I knew better. My mother had always sided with Grace, ever since we were kids. There's a memory I can't shake. I was 12, Grace 9. We were making cookies in the kitchen. Grace dropped the tray, burned them all. I tried to help, but Mom scolded me for hovering. Later, she let Grace lick the bowl and told her, "You'll get it right next time." I never got that same Grace. Now, decades later, the pattern repeated itself. Grace made a mess. Mom cleaned it up and I was told to stay quiet. Only this time it cost me everything. When I reached my apartment, I didn't even take off my coat. I just sat on the floor, surrounded by old sketches of bakery logos, flavor charts, supplier invoices, all pieces of the world I'd built. The silence was heavy. I opened my laptop and reread the email again, forcing myself to look at it, to feel the full sting. Then something caught my eye. At the bottom of the message was a small note from the system, automated routine, almost invisible. Trademark renewal due. Maple and Rise Baking Co. Deadline 30 days. I blinked, staring at it, the words sinking in slowly. I remembered filing that trademark years ago under my name before the bakery was even profitable. Grace had called it paranoid. Mom said it was unnecessary paperwork. But I did it anyway. I leaned back, a slow, unfamiliar smile forming. Maybe they took the bakery, but the name that was still mine. I got up, made coffee, and stared out the window at the city waking up. Portland's skyline shimmered through the drizzle, the same mix of beauty and grit that had always reminded me why I fought so hard for my dream. They wanted me quiet, small, gone, but they forgot something crucial. You can kick me out of the kitchen, but you can't erase the recipe that started it all. I opened my laptop again, clicked on the USPTO website, and typed in Maple and Rise. There it was, owner Lydia M. Carter, valid until next renewal. A laugh escaped me. It wasn't joy, it was recognition. I closed the laptop, wiped the counter clean, and whispered to the empty apartment, "You took my bakery." But I still own the name. Outside, the rain hit the window harder, steady, rhythmic, like the sound of dough being kneaded. The world felt heavier, but inside me something small and steady began to rise again. 2 days passed before I could bring myself to walk past the bakery again. The rain hadn't stopped, and the gray skies made Portland feel smaller, tighter, like the whole city was holding its breath. I parked across the street and watched through the window. Grace was inside, smiling at a customer. Her hair perfect, her laughter loud enough to carry through the glass. My mother stood beside her, clipboard in hand, pretending to inspect the display case. They looked like a team. My team. Only now I was the ghost watching them from outside. I gripped the steering wheel until my fingers ached. The Maple and Rise logo gleamed above the door, gold lettering against white, simple and clean. I remembered the day I designed it. I'd stayed up all night with a marker and a coffee-stained notebook, sketching names until the words Maple and Rise felt right. Maple for warmth. Rise for resilience. It wasn't just a name. It was everything I'd worked for, and now it felt like a lie. I finally exhaled, started the engine, and drove away. There was no point in standing out there like some sad movie character hoping for justice. If I was going to fight, it wouldn't be through a window. That afternoon, I made an appointment with an attorney named Rachel Kim, a sharp woman in her 40s, with espresso dark eyes and a voice that could cut through noise like glass. Her office smelled faintly of paper and rain. She skimmed through the stack of documents I'd brought, flipping each page with a rhythm that made me nervous. So she said, finally, looking up, "You're saying your mother and sister transferred ownership of your LLC without consent?" "Yes, they forged my signature." She nodded slowly. "You're sure I'd never agree to that?" "And I've got the original trademark under my name." Her expression changed slightly, interest flickering. "Trademark? As in the brand name, yes. Maple and Rise Baking Co. I registered it 6 years ago. Rachel leaned back in her chair. That's good. Very good. Because while they can take your business assets, they can't legally use a registered mark without the owner's permission. I blinked, my pulse quickening. So, what does that mean exactly? She smiled slightly. It means you still hold the leash. If they keep operating under that name, they're violating federal trademark law. Cease and desist injunction potential damages the whole recipe. I almost laughed. You make it sound like a menu. Justice usually is, she said, sliding the papers into a folder. The trick is serving it at the right temperature. I left her office with my heart pounding and a folder full of options. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest didn't feel so heavy. The rain had stopped by the time I reached my car, and the city smelled like wet pavement and hope. That evening, I called Maggie. Please tell me you're not baking stress muffins again, she said as soon as she picked up. No muffins, I said. I met with a lawyer. Oh boy, what's the damage? None yet. Turns out I still own the name. Legally. Grace and Mom took the bakery, but the trademark's still mine. There was a pause, then Maggie's sharp laugh. You're kidding! That's poetic! It's justice, I said quietly. Maggie exhaled, the sound softening. You know I always said you had a flair for drama. Guess it runs in the dough. Her joke broke something in me, a laugh that turned into a sigh, half relief, half grief. It's not about revenge, I said. I just want to stop them from turning everything I built into their puppet show. Then do it, she said. You've been the quiet one for too long. It's time they hear what silence sounds like when it echoes. The next morning I drove downtown to the USPTO field office, my paperwork sealed neatly in a folder. I renewed the trademark, updated the owner address, and requested official confirmation. The clerk, a young man with tired eyes and a kind smile, stamped the document and said, Congratulations, Miss Carter. Maple and Rise is yours for another decade. Thank you, I whispered. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. When I walked out, the sky was pale blue, the kind of soft light that feels like a beginning. I stopped at a cafe across the street and ordered a latte, my hands trembling slightly as I took the first sip. I could almost hear my dad's voice, never let anyone else name your dream. He used to say that when I was little, when I wanted to open a lemonade stand, and Grace tried to call it Sugar Sisters. I'd cried because it didn't feel right, and he'd crouched beside me smiling. If it's yours, you name it. If someone else does, it's theirs. I smiled into my coffee. Maybe he'd been preparing me for this all along. By noon, my phone started buzzing again. Texts from Grace. Grace, hey, did you do something with the business registration, Grace? Our accountant says there's a weird notice about the trademark. Can you call me Grace? Mom's freaking out. Please respond. I didn't. I let her messages pile up until my phone buzzed itself quiet. I knew Grace. Panic wasn't her color, but it looked good on her. That night I lay in bed unable to sleep. My mind replayed every conversation, every moment I'd bitten my tongue, every time Mom said, Don't make things difficult, Lydia. I whispered to the ceiling, maybe difficult is what they needed. The following day, I went to the bakery during off hours. The windows were dark. They'd closed early, probably for inventory or damage control. I pressed my hand against the cool glass and looked inside. Everything was neat, staged, perfect, sterile. My old apron still hung on the hook by the back door, flour-stained, lonely. Then I saw something on the counter, a framed photo of the three of us taken on opening day. My arm around Grace's shoulders, Mom holding the scissors for the ribbon cutting. We looked so happy. But the more I stared, the more I noticed what had always been there. I was leaning toward them. They weren't leaning back. I left before I started crying. At home, I opened my laptop and drafted an email to Rachel. Hi. Rachel, please proceed with the cease and desist letter for unauthorized use of Maple and Rise Baking Co. trademark. Effective immediately. I'll handle the PR fallout myself. Thank you, Lydia. My finger hovered over send. For a brief second, I thought of Grace's face when she got the news of Mom's disappointment. The endless guilt trips the inevitable. How could you? Then I clicked send. The next morning I woke to silence. No calls, no texts, just a clear inbox and a calm heart. I brewed coffee-buttered toast and opened the window. Portland's air smelled like rain again, but this time it didn't weigh me down. As I sat there, sunlight touching the rim of my mug, I realized I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt steady, still. People always say revenge feels sweet. But maybe it isn't sweetness at all. Maybe it's balance, the quiet kind that hums beneath your skin like a heartbeat finally sinking to its rhythm. My phone buzzed once more. A new email from Rachel, letter delivered. Acknowledgement confirmed. I set the phone down, exhaled, and whispered to the empty kitchen. Let's see how perfect their pastries taste without the name. Outside, the clouds broke sunlight spilling through in golden streaks. The air smelled faintly of bread, and for the first time since they took everything from me, I didn't feel empty. I felt ready. The first call came just after lunch. I was wiping down the counter when my phone started buzzing with Grace's name flashing across the screen. I stared at it for a long second before answering. Her voice burst through high and panicked. Lydia, what did you do? I took a sip of coffee before answering. What do you mean? Don't play dumb, she snapped. The bakery just got served a legal notice. A cease and desist. It says we can't use the name Maple and Rise. Are you insane? That's our brand. It's my brand, I said calmly, and you're using it without permission. There was a pause, one of those rare moments when Grace couldn't find words fast enough. You're actually serious, she whispered. I'm actually legal, I said, and hung up. 5 minutes later, my mother called. I didn't need to see the caller ID. I could already hear the tone she'd used, the one laced with disappointment instead of guilt. I let it ring twice, then answered. Lydia, she began, her voice tight. What have you done to your sister? She's in tears. You can't just stop, I said. You both took something from me. I just took it back. You're overreacting, she said sharply. It's a family business. No, Mom, I said. It was a family business until you cut me out. Your father would be heartbroken if he saw you like this. I almost laughed. My father would be heartbroken if he saw what you did to me. Her breath hitched. You don't talk to me that way. Then maybe you should have treated me like a daughter, not a liability. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I could hear her breathing uneven and shallow, like she was trying to decide whether to scold or cry. This isn't you, she said finally. You were always the calm one, the steady one. Maybe steady, finally snapped, I said. She tried again. You're tearing this family apart. I looked out the window at the rain streaking the glass and said quietly, You did that the moment you taught Grace that taking was easier than earning. Then I hung up. I stood there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, the echo of her voice lingering like a bad aftertaste. The quiet afterward felt heavy but clean. That evening Maggie showed up with 2 coffees, and that look she always gave me when she sensed I'd done something drastic. So she said, handing me a cup, How's your day been? Any small fires, emotional explosions? I arched an eyebrow. Grace called. Then Mom. Ah, she said, taking a seat. So, full nuclear, pretty much. She sipped her coffee. And you? I'm fine, I said, though. My voice was too calm to be convincing. Maggie studied me for a moment. You don't look fine. You look like someone who just watched the world catch fire and isn't sure whether to laugh or pour water. I'm done pouring, I said softly. Her expression softened. You really did it, huh? Sent the letter, I nodded. She whistled low. Damn. You're the quiet kind of terrifying. I smiled faintly. They called me controlling. I guess I finally took control. Maggie leaned forward, elbows on the table. You realize this is going to explode online, right? Portland's small. Someone's going to talk. Let them, I said. I'm tired of hiding. That night I couldn't sleep. My phone kept buzzing, texts, emails, voicemails. I ignored them all. Instead, I sat by the window watching the rain fall in soft silver lines. Somewhere across town, I knew my mother was pacing her kitchen rehearsing lines for sympathy. Grace was probably calling her friends, trying to spin the story. I almost pitied them. Almost. By morning, the news had already begun to spread. A customer posted on Reddit local bakery Maple and Rise closed temporarily after family dispute. Sister drama goes full Gordon Ramsay. Another added she trademarked the name years ago. Queen behavior. I shouldn't have read the comments, but I did. Some people called me ruthless. Others called me brave. One said, "That's not revenge. That's karma with a business license." I laughed harder than I had in months. At noon, my phone buzzed again, Mom. I let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. I pressed play. Her voice was brittle but carefully composed. "Lydia, this has gone too far. You're humiliating us. Grace says the customers are canceling their orders and the suppliers are panicking. You need to fix this before it becomes public." Her use of us stung more than I wanted to admit. I deleted the message and whispered, "It already is." That evening, I got another call, this time from Grace's husband, Ryan. He'd never liked me, but he always pretended to be polite. "Lydia," he said, his voice tight with fake civility, "you've made your point. Grace is a mess. Your mom's furious. Do you really need to destroy your family to prove you're right? I'm not destroying anything I said. I'm just cleaning up what's already rotten." "Jesus, Lydia," he muttered. "You sound just like your father, so obsessed with fairness you forget about kindness." I paused, biting back a dozen things I wanted to say. "Kindness without honesty is just cowardice," I said finally. He sighed. "You've changed." "No," I said. "You just finally met the version of me that stopped apologizing." When the call ended, I set the phone down and poured myself a glass of wine. The rain had stopped leaving the city, slick and glistening. Lights reflected in puddles like tiny lanterns. I leaned back against the couch and thought about how quiet it was. Not lonely quiet, balanced quiet. The next morning, I woke to a headline notification on my phone: Portland Family Bakery in legal turmoil. I clicked it open. There was a photo of Grace looking distraught outside the bakery, mom behind her lips tight and eyes wet. The article quoted a source close to the family, probably one of Grace's friends. "It's so sad. Lydia was always intense." Maybe this was her breaking point. I almost smiled. They still didn't get it. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a rebuild. Later that afternoon, I got a message from an unknown number. It was just 2 words: "You won." No name, no context. I didn't need one. That evening, Maggie came over again, bringing Thai takeout and the kind of energy only best friends can bring when they're both proud and slightly terrified for you. "They're melting down," she said, between bites of pad see ew. I saw Grace's Instagram. She turned off comments. "That's basically a digital funeral." I laughed. "You sound too happy about that." "I'm happy for you," she said. "You spent years playing peacemaker while they painted you as the problem. Now you finally flipped the script." I set my chopsticks down. "It doesn't feel like victory. It just feels quiet." "Good," she said. "Quiet means they're not shouting over you anymore." I looked at her, realizing how right she was. For the first time in a long time, no one was talking at me. No one was explaining away my feelings, justifying my erasure. The silence wasn't empty, it was mine. Before bed, I checked my inbox one last time. A single new message sat there from Rachel, my attorney. "They've acknowledged receipt. Legal compliance begins immediately. They must remove all branding within 72 hours or face penalties." I closed the laptop and turned off the light. Lying there in the dark, I thought about the smell of the bakery vanilla sugar coffee and exhaustion. For years I'd tied my worth to that smell, but now the air felt clean. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, low and steady, like the sound of something old finally breaking apart. I whispered into the dark, "They took my bakery. I took back my name. Now we're even." And for the first time in years, I fell asleep without dreaming. By the time the sun came up on Thursday, the story had spread beyond Portland. Every local outlet had picked it up: the bakery feud, the sisters turned rivals, the mother choosing sides. I didn't have to look for it. It was everywhere. My phone buzzed with texts from people I hadn't spoken to in years, all saying the same thing in different tones. "Are you okay?" or "Good for you?" or "Wow, I always knew Grace was a piece of work." I muted my phone and brewed coffee. The smell filled the kitchen, grounding me in something normal. I turned on the radio, hoping for a distraction, but even there the announcer was joking about Portland's most dramatic bakery. I laughed under my breath. If they only knew. By mid-morning I drove downtown. Rachel, my lawyer, had called asking me to sign the final compliance documents. Her office was in a renovated building overlooking the river, glass walls and concrete floors, sharp and clean like her voice. She handed me a stack of papers when I walked in. "They're folding," she said simply. "Your mother's attorney sent notice this morning. They'll stop using the Maple and Rise name effective immediately." I exhaled, the sound shaky. "Just like that," Rachel smiled. "Legal pressure works wonders. But I'll warn you, this won't end quietly. Family rarely does." "I'm not looking for quiet anymore," I said. She nodded, then hesitated. "Can I give you a piece of advice? Not printed on legal paper, please. Don't check the comments. Don't justify yourself. Let the silence speak. It's louder than anything you could say." I smiled faintly. "You sound like you've lived this." "Everyone has a Grace somewhere," she said, sliding the pen toward me. I signed every page, each stroke steadier than the last. When it was done, Rachel shook my hand and said softly, "Congratulations. You just took back your legacy." Outside, the rain had stopped, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth. I walked along the riverfront, my reflection fractured in the moving water. There was no triumph in my chest, just an unfamiliar calm. That calm lasted until my phone rang again. "Mom." I almost didn't answer, but something in me wanted to hear her voice. "Lydia," she said, her voice strained, "your sister is a wreck. The bakery's closed. People are gossiping. You've humiliated this family." I kept walking, eyes on the water. "No, Mom." I ended a lie. "Don't twist this," she snapped. "You could have handled it privately." "I tried privately," I said. "You just called it overreacting." "Grace didn't deserve this," she said, voice trembling. "She was just trying to help. Help herself," I corrected. "And you helped her do it." "She's your sister." I stopped walking. "You keep saying that like it's a magic word. But being related doesn't give someone the right to erase me." Silence stretched between us. Then softer, she said, "You sound so cold." "I'm not cold," I said. "I'm done being burned." When I hung up, the sky cracked open again, soft drizzle returning, as if the weather couldn't decide whose side it was on. That night, Maggie came over with dinner. "You've officially broken the internet," she said, dropping a takeout bag on the table. "There's a video of Grace crying outside the bakery. People are taking sides like it's a reality show." I groaned. "I didn't want sides." "Well, you've got them. Team Lydia's trending." She opened her laptop, showing me clips and screenshots. One headline read, "She took back her dream, a sister's silent revenge." Another said, "Portland's pastry war when justice smells like bread." I rubbed my temples. God, they make it sound cinematic. Maggie smiled gently. "It is kind of. But I know you. This isn't about fame. You just wanted your dignity back." I looked at her and said quietly, "For years I was told to be the bigger person. Turns out being bigger doesn't mean shrinking." Later, when she left, I stayed at the table long after the food went cold. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about my dad again, his steady hands, the way he used to say family is like dough, Lydia. If you handle it too much, it falls apart. Maybe ours had been falling apart for years. I just happened to be the first to stop pretending it was still whole. The next morning, I went to the bakery one last time. The door was locked. A paper sign was taped to the glass, closed until further notice. The window display was empty. No croissants, no cinnamon rolls, no smell of butter in the air, just silence. I pressed my hand against the glass, tracing the faint outline where the Maple and Rise logo had been peeled off. The residue still clung to the surface, faint but stubborn. My reflection looked back at me, tired, calm-free. A few minutes later, Nora's car pulled up. She got out slowly, wearing her tan coat, her umbrella half broken against the wind. "Lydia," she called softly. I turned, bracing myself. She walked closer, her eyes wet but not angry. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, I did." Her lips trembled. "It was just business. It was my life." She sighed, glancing at the empty storefront. "You've always had to win, haven't you?" I met her eyes. "No, I've always had to survive." For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say more, but instead, she turned toward the door, staring through the glass. "Your father loved this place," she whispered. "I did too," I said. "That's why I couldn't let you ruin it." She flinched just slightly, then said, "You're colder than I thought." I shook my head. "No, I'm just tired of being the one who gets burned." The rain started again, light but steady. She opened her umbrella and walked back to her car. I watched her drive off until the taillights disappeared. Then I turned back to the window, whispering to the ghost of my dream, "You deserved better than them." That evening, I sat by the window with a notebook and pen, something I hadn't done since my father died. I began to write not recipes this time, but thoughts, memories, fragments of things I'd been too afraid to say out loud. I wrote about Grace's first batch of cookies, about Mom's constant corrections, about Dad's laughter echoing through the kitchen. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the words stopped trembling. Halfway through, I realized what I was writing wasn't anger. It was truth. When I put the pen down, I looked around my small apartment, quiet, simple mine. The smell of bread still lingered from the loaf I'd baked earlier. It wasn't perfect. It had cracked on top, uneven. But it was real. Outside, the city lights shimmered through the rain. For the first time, I didn't see failure when I looked at the reflection in my window. I saw beginning. I whispered, "Let them have their silence. I've got mine." And as the rain softened to a mist, I felt something rise inside me, steady, warm, and unbreakable. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was balance. I woke up to sunlight spilling through my curtains and the faint hum of the city outside. It was the first morning in weeks that didn't feel like I was waking into a fight. My phone was quiet, my email inbox clear, no new threats, no guilt-laden messages, no chaos disguised as family concern. For a moment, it almost felt like peace. I made coffee and stood by the window watching steam rise from the mug. Across the street, a couple walked their dog, laughing at something private. Their ease felt foreign. For years, my life had been a constant negotiation, pleasing, defending, enduring. And now, with silence around me, I didn't quite know what to do with it. Then, just as I sat down to drink, my phone buzzed. It was Maggie. "So, your sister's bakery funeral went viral," she said, before I could say hello. I laughed softly. "Of course it did. They filmed her crying outside the shop yesterday. Some influencer reposted it with a caption, 'Karma smells like cinnamon rolls.'" I shouldn't laugh, but you are," I said, smiling. She chuckled. "You okay?" "I think so. You sound calm." "I am. For the first time in a long time." "Good," she said, "because calm suits you better than revenge." After we hung up, I walked to my kitchen table and opened my laptop. The trademark confirmation email from Rachel sat neatly at the top of my inbox. Official revocation complete. Those words glowed against the screen, quiet and powerful. I closed my eyes, remembering the first night I baked in that old kitchen with Dad. He'd stood behind me, arms crossed, pretending to critique my form. "You're too tense," he'd said. "Dough feels fear." Back then I'd laughed, thinking he was just teasing. Now I understood. Every recipe I'd ever made carried pieces of me, my patience, my control, my love, my exhaustion. And when Grace and Mom took the bakery, they hadn't just taken a business. They'd taken the part of me that believed hard work was enough to earn respect. But now I was taking that part back. Later that afternoon, I walked through downtown Portland. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glazed and shining. I passed the corner cafe where I used to drop off pastries before opening hours. The owner, Joe, looked up from behind the counter and smiled when she saw me. "Well, if it isn't the comeback queen," she said. I laughed. "Please don't call me that." "Too late. You deserve it." She poured me a cup of coffee and leaned on the counter. "Heard what happened. Everyone has." "You okay?" "I'm surviving," I said. She nodded. "You know your croissants were the best thing to happen to this neighborhood. We miss them." "I might start baking again," I said. "But smaller this time. Just for me," good Joe said. "The world doesn't need another bakery. It needs people who remember why they started one." When I left, the warmth of that conversation lingered like sunlight. Maybe she was right. Maybe the next chapter didn't have to be about fighting or proving anything. Maybe it could just be about creating again. That evening, I set up my mixer on the small counter in my apartment. The whir of the blades filled the quiet, steady, and comforting. I sifted flour, measured sugar, cracked eggs. Every motion felt like therapy, like muscle memory, leading me back to something I'd lost. When I slid the first tray into the oven, I sat down and closed my eyes. The smell of butter rose into the air, sweet and warm, wrapping around me like a memory. Half an hour later, the phone rang. I didn't look at the screen, I just answered. "Lydia," Mom said, her voice low and deliberate. "We need to talk," I sighed. "About what?" "About Grace," she said. "She's not doing well. She won't leave the house. She says you've ruined her life." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "I didn't ruin anything. I stopped a lie." "She looked up to you," Mom said, "even when she acted like she didn't." "Is that supposed to make me feel guilty?" "No," she said quietly. "It's supposed to make you remember that she's still your sister." I didn't answer. The timer on the oven beeped in the background. Mom continued, "Lydia, this family is falling apart. Can't we fix it?" "You can't fix something that was never built right, Mom." She exhaled sharply, frustration cracking through her voice. "You've always been dramatic. And you've always confused obedience with love," I said. There was silence. I could almost hear her swallow her pride through the line. "I don't know when you became so cold." "I'm not cold," I said softly. "I'm just done being ignored." I hung up before she could reply. The timer beeped again. I opened the oven and pulled out the tray. The pastries were golden and uneven, a little messy, imperfect, but mine. I set them on the counter to cool and watched the steam curl upward. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for too many years. Later, Maggie came by unannounced as usual. She took one look at the pastries and grinned. "Oh, thank God. You're baking again. I was starting to worry your oven would die of neglect." I handed her one. "Careful, they're still hot." She bit into it and closed her eyes. "Jesus, that's good. You could sell these." I laughed. "No, this is just for me." She studied me for a moment, chewing slowly. "You know you're different now." "Different how?" "Lighter. Like you finally put something down." I thought about it. Maybe I did. She nodded, then said softly, "You know, revenge stories don't usually end like this." "I'm not in a revenge story," I said. "I'm in a recovery one." The words surprised me, but they felt true. After she left, I sat on the couch with a glass of wine and looked around my apartment. The walls were still bare, but the space didn't feel empty anymore. The air smelled like sugar and butter and peace. I thought about how much time I'd spent chasing approval, trying to earn a love that came with conditions. It hit me then the only thing I'd ever really needed from my family was respect. And when they wouldn't give it, I learned to give it to myself. Outside, the city lights glowed faintly through the mist. Somewhere, Grace was probably scrolling through her phone, reading comments, watching sympathy turn into pity. I didn't wish her pain, not really. But I couldn't save her from the consequences she'd baked herself into. I picked up my notebook and wrote one line, "Peace doesn't always come sweet. Sometimes it's the bitter crust that keeps everything whole." Then I laughed softly and closed the book. Before going to bed, I walked to the window and looked out at the street below. The night air was cool, the sky clear enough to see a few stars. I whispered, "Dad, I think I'm finally okay." The hum of the city felt like a heartbeat, steady, alive, forgiving. When I turned off the light, the scent of fresh pastries lingered. It wasn't success or revenge that filled the room. It was something quieter, richer. Something that felt like home again. I didn't plan to drive by the bakery that morning. It just happened. The route was muscle memory left at the light 2 blocks down past the coffee shop that used to carry my scones. I told myself I was just running errands, but the truth was, curiosity pulled me there like gravity. When I turned the corner, I almost didn't recognize it. The windows were bare, the sign above the door gone. Only a faint outline of where Maple and Rise used to be lingered against the glass like a ghost. The door was locked, the display cases empty. For a second I stood there on the sidewalk, my breath fogging the window. This was the place I'd poured 8 years of my life into, my laughter, my sleepless nights, my hands, my heart. Now it was nothing but silence and dust. A woman walking by slowed down and said softly, "Shame, isn't it? That place used to be my favorite." I smiled politely, my throat tightening. "Yeah," I said. "It was mine too." She walked off, leaving me with the sound of the wind pressing against the windows. I stayed there a moment longer, then turned to leave. But before I did, I whispered under my breath, "You deserved better." Back in the car, I let the engine idle. Across the street, the reflection of the empty storefront shimmered on a puddle. It hit me then how strange it was how something that had once been so full of life could vanish without a sound. Not even a crumble left behind. I thought revenge would feel sharper, more triumphant. Instead, it felt quiet, like the end of a long storm. That night, I met Maggie at her apartment. She had wine waiting and a candle burning that smelled faintly of vanilla and smoke. "You look peaceful," she said, handing me a glass. "I'm getting there," I said. She smiled. "So what's next?" "You've taken back your name. You've watched karma work overtime. What do you do when the fire burns out?" "I think I rebuild," I said, staring at the wine in my glass. "But slower this time, smaller, something new, something honest," I said. "Not about proving anything, just about doing what I love again." Maggie grinned. "You sound like your dad." "I've been hearing his voice a lot lately," I said softly. "Every time I bake, every time I stop myself from apologizing." "He'd be proud," she said, "even if he'd probably make you add more salt." We both laughed. It was the kind of easy laughter I hadn't felt in years. The kind that didn't need to be guarded or explained. When I got home, I opened my laptop. My cursor blinked on a blank page waiting. I typed the words, "bread and balance." For a second, I just stared at it. The name felt right, warm, whole, grounded. I started sketching ideas for a community baking class, something small. A workshop for people who wanted to bake for healing, not perfection. The more I wrote, the lighter I felt. By morning, I'd outlined a plan. 6 weeks weekend sessions focus on mindfulness through baking. I didn't want a business this time, I wanted a sanctuary. I rented a tiny studio space on the east side, bare walls, concrete floors, and enough light to fill the room with gold by noon. It smelled faintly of old wood and possibility. When the landlord handed me the keys, I held them for a moment before saying, "This isn't a bakery." He smiled. "Then what is it?" I looked around at the empty space and said, "A beginning." The first week I scrubbed every inch of it. I painted the walls a soft cream, hung my father's old whisk, sat on the back wall, and set up 3 long wooden tables. Maggie brought plants. Elliot, my old photographer friend, helped install lights. Slowly, the place started to breathe. The night before the first class, I sat alone on the floor, surrounded by bags of flour and stacks of mixing bowls. My hands itched to work, but instead, I just sat still. The quiet wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful, earned. The next morning, 6 women showed up, each one carrying something invisible. A widow, a retired teacher, a nurse who'd just come off a brutal year. They smiled nervously, introducing themselves in soft voices. I smiled back, realizing I didn't have to fill the silence for once. "Welcome to Bread and Balance," I said. "Here we don't aim for perfect loaves. We aim for patience. Because bread doesn't care about your schedule, it only rises when it's ready." They laughed quietly. The tension in the room melted. We mixed, kneaded, waited. The smell of yeast filled the air, warm and nostalgic. As I guided them through folding dough, one woman looked up and said, "You seem so calm, like you've done this forever." "I guess I've been practicing," I said, smiling. "Not the baking, the peace." When the class ended, one of the women, an older lady named June, stayed behind. She looked at me for a long time before saying, "You know, my daughter stopped speaking to me 5 years ago. I came here because I thought maybe learning to make something again would help me forgive her. I didn't realize it would help me forgive myself too." Her words hit somewhere deep. I knotted my throat tight. "That's what baking does," I said quietly. "It teaches you to let things rise again." After she left, I cleaned the counters, still thinking about what she said. The smell of fresh bread lingered. I could feel my father in that room, the warmth, the quiet laughter that used to fill our old kitchen. I whispered, "We're still baking, Dad, just in a different oven." Later that evening, I got a text from Maggie. "You did it. I'm proud of you." I smiled at the screen and typed back, "It's not done yet, but it's rising." When I locked up the studio that night, the sky was painted in pink and gold. I stood outside for a moment, breathing in the air. Across the street, a couple walked by, holding hands, and I caught my reflection in the glass door, flower on my cheek. Tired eyes, small smile. It looked like a woman who'd stopped running from herself. On the drive home, I passed the empty bakery again. The windows still dark, the sign still missing. This time I didn't feel anything at all. No anger, no ache, just gratitude. That place had broken me once, but maybe it also made room for who I was becoming. At home, I baked one last loaf before bed. A simple one. No fancy fillings, no designs. Just flour, water, salt, and patience. When it came out of the oven, the crust crackled in the quiet kitchen. I tore off a piece and tasted it, warm and imperfect. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't bitter. It was balance. I smiled to myself and said softly, "Let the dough rest." Then I turned off the lights and let the house fill with the smell of something finally finished and something else just beginning. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, slipped beneath my door with the rest of the mail. At first, I thought it was another invoice or some dull piece of paperwork from the new studio. But when I picked it up, I saw the embossed seal, Carter and Blake Attorneys at Law, the same firm representing my mother and Grace. My stomach tightened. I carried it to the kitchen, set it next to my coffee, and stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single page printed neatly on letterhead. It wasn't a threat this time. It was confirmation. The letter stated that Maple and Rise Baking Co. had officially ceased operations under my trademark. All signage, packaging, and digital branding had been removed, effective immediately. The closing line read, "As of this date, all legal rights to the Maple and Rise trademark remain solely with Miss Lydia M. Carter." For a long time, I just sat there tracing the words with my fingertip. It was over. No more arguments, no more emails, no more pretending there could be peace while lies still stood. I had my name back, my legacy. The kitchen felt too quiet for a victory, but maybe that was the point. I folded the letter carefully, set it on the counter, and poured another cup of coffee. Outside rain tapped against the windows like it always did in Portland, soft, rhythmic, never-ending. For the first time in years, it didn't sound sad. It sounded steady. By noon, the news had spread. Grace must have told someone. Maybe she couldn't stand the silence anymore. Customers showed up to find the doors locked and the windows bare. Photos started popping up online. Maple and Rise closed for good. Some comments were sympathetic, others weren't. Guess karma's got good taste. You can't bake trust. I didn't post, didn't respond. I just watched it unfold detached as if it were happening to someone else. Then an hour later, my phone rang. Mom. I let it ring until the sound filled the apartment until it finally stopped. A few seconds later, it rang again. I sighed and picked up. Lydia, she said breathless, what have you done? What I had to. You destroyed your sister's life. She destroyed mine first. Her voice broke. Do you know what this looks like? You've humiliated her. You've humiliated us. No, I said quietly. You did that when you made me disappear from my own company. You could have forgiven her, she said. You're supposed to be the bigger person. I was, I said. For 34 years, there was silence. I could hear her breathing shaky and uneven. Then she said, almost pleading, You can't let this stand. Grace is devastated. She should be, I said. Maybe now she'll understand what it feels like to lose something you built. Mom's tone hardened. You sound just like your father. I smiled without meaning to. Thank you. She exhaled sharply, furious. You're making this into a war. No, I said. I'm ending one. Before she could answer, I hung up. The click of the phone was louder than I expected. For a few seconds I stood there, heart pounding. Then I realized it wasn't guilt I felt. It was relief. That afternoon I took a walk by the river. The air was crisp, the water dark and steady. The world didn't feel different, but I did. Somewhere behind me a chapter had finally closed, and there was no going back. By evening, Maggie showed up with Thai takeout and 2 bottles of wine. You did it, she said, setting the bag down. The bakery's officially toast. I groaned. Bad pun. Can't help it, she said. You've been waiting for this moment. How does it feel? I thought about it. Strange. Quiet. Like something that's been pulling at me for years just stopped. Maggie sat down across from me. You look calm, which is terrifying. I laughed. You sound like Grace. No, she said. Grace thought calm meant weak. I know better. We ate in silence for a while, the kind of silence that isn't empty but earned. After dinner, she said, So what now? Are you going to tell them about the workshops? Not yet, I said. They'll hear when everyone else does. Maggie raised an eyebrow. That's cold. No, I said, setting down my fork. That's balance. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. You've changed. I think I just remembered who I was before they rewrote me. The next morning, the chaos began. Photos of the closed bakery were everywhere. Former employees posted confused updates on social media. Customers asked what happened. And then the gossip blogs picked it up. Local drama turned spectacle. One headline read, Sister versus Sister, Portland's family bakery shuts down after legal dispute. Another said revenge or justice inside the bitter feud that brought down Maple and Rise. By noon, Grace was trending locally. Videos surfaced her pacing outside the shuttered store, phone pressed to her ear, mascara streaked. People filmed from across the street whispering commentary. Someone posted, Never steal from the quiet ones. I watched the clips once, then closed my laptop. This wasn't joy. It wasn't even vindication. It was inevitability. That evening the phone rang again. Grace. I almost didn't answer, but something in me wanted closure. Lydia, she said, voice shaking. You have to fix this. Fix what? The bakery, the reputation, everything. People are laughing at me. I sighed. Grace, you laughed at me when I told you this would happen. This isn't the same, she snapped. You're my sister. I was your sister when you stole from me, I said. Now I'm just the owner of the name you used to destroy. Her breath hitched. You've turned into someone I don't even recognize. No, I said softly. I finally turned into myself. She was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard, she said, I didn't think you'd actually go through with it. You never do, I said. She started to cry. You ruined everything. No, I whispered. You did. I just stopped cleaning up after you. When she didn't answer, I hung up. The apartment was silent again, but this time the quiet wasn't heavy. It was sacred. I walked to my desk, opened the drawer, and pulled out the letter. The legal stamp glinted under the lamplight. I traced my name on it, and felt something settle deep in my chest. Outside, thunder rumbled over the city, low and distant. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window watching the rain begin again. For years I'd believed revenge was about fire, about burning everything to make your pain visible. But maybe it wasn't fire at all. Maybe it was water slow steady, carving its way through stone until the truth showed itself. I raised the glass almost like a toast and whispered, "Here's to balance." Across town, I imagined the lights going dark inside the bakery. The ovens cold, the walls echoing with what used to be. It wasn't cruelty that filled me, it was clarity. They called me controlling, dramatic, difficult. But maybe what I really was done. When I finally went to bed, the rain still fell steady against the glass. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, soft, patient, almost approving. And for the first time in my life, I didn't dream of the bakery. I dreamed of light. By Friday morning, the story was everywhere. What had started as local gossip had turned into headlines across the region. Family feud ends in bakery collapse. Sisters trademark win sparks online debate. Every photo showed Grace outside the shop, hair, disheveled, tears streaking her face, the closed sign hanging behind her like punctuation. I scrolled for a moment, then closed the laptop. I didn't need to read the comments. I already knew what they would say. Half would call me cruel. The other half would call it justice. The truth was quieter than both. The studio smelled like cinnamon and coffee. My second workshop was starting in an hour, but I couldn't focus. My phone buzzed again, messages from people I barely knew, some offering congratulations, others asking for interviews. I ignored them all. The only one I opened was from Maggie. "You've officially broken Portland Twitter. Proud of you. Also eat something." I smiled, set the phone down, and took a slow breath. Through the window, light streamed across the wooden tables the same way it used to fall across the bakery counters. Except this time there was no chaos, no shouting, no one telling me I was too controlling. Just quiet. When the first students arrived, they carried that same nervous excitement I'd seen the week before. They talked softly, their voices blending with the hum of the oven. One woman, June, the widow who'd spoken to me before, brought her granddaughter along this time. "She loves baking," June said. "I thought maybe you could teach her how to make something from scratch." "Of course," I said, smiling. "That's the best way to start." As we kneaded dough together, I found myself saying something I hadn't planned. Baking isn't about getting it perfect. It's about forgiving yourself for the mess you make on the way there. June smiled knowingly. "Sounds like life." "Exactly," I said. By the end of class, the room was full of laughter, the air thick with the smell of fresh bread. When the loaves came out golden, the students clapped, proud of their work. I watched them, realizing how different this kind of creation felt. It wasn't about profit or perfection. It was about breathing again. After they left, I sat at one of the tables looking around the empty studio. The sunlight was softer, now fading into late afternoon. I should have felt proud, but instead, there was this ache I couldn't name. It wasn't guilt. It was the ghost of habit, the instinct to apologize even when I'd done nothing wrong. Then my phone rang. "Mom." I stared at the screen until it stopped buzzing. A few seconds later, it rang again. And again. Finally, I picked up. "Lydia," she said, her voice trembling. "Please just listen." "I'm listening." "Grace is falling apart," she said. "She hasn't eaten. She won't leave the house. The bakery was her whole life." "It was mine first," I said quietly. "She didn't mean to hurt you. She signed papers to erase me, Mom." "You both did." Her voice cracked. "You don't understand. She's always been fragile. You were the strong one. I thought you could handle it." I let out a breath that sounded more like a laugh. "That's not strength, Mom. That's neglect. You gave her excuses and gave me responsibility." "That's not fair," she said. "No," I said. "It's finally fair." There was silence on the other end. I could almost hear her trying to find something to say, something that might make me small again. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Your father would hate what this has done to us. My father would hate what you did to me," I said. She started to cry. "I don't know how to fix this." "You can't," I said. "You can only stop pretending you didn't break it." I hung up before she could answer. For a long time I sat there staring at the empty chair across from me. The sun had dipped lower, turning the room gold. The quiet pressed around me like a blanket. I didn't feel proud of what I'd done, but I didn't regret it either. Maybe peace wasn't supposed to feel triumphant. Maybe it was supposed to feel still. Later that evening, Maggie showed up unannounced, balancing a pizza box and a six-pack. "You look like someone who needs carbs and company," she said, kicking off her shoes. "You're psychic," I said, smiling. She flopped down at the table, opened the box, and handed me a slice. "So the world's still spinning, huh?" "Barely," I said. She chewed thoughtfully, then said, "Grace posted a story today. Something about losing everything. People are divided, half pity, half karma jokes. You've basically become a Reddit legend." "Great," I said dryly. "Exactly what I always wanted." Maggie leaned back. "You okay?" I hesitated. "I don't know. I thought this would feel like winning. But it doesn't. It just feels balanced. That's not a bad thing." "I know," I said. "But part of me keeps waiting for someone to call and say, 'You went too far.'" Maggie reached across the table, her eyes steady. "You didn't go too far. You just stopped walking backward." That line stuck with me long after she left. The next morning I woke early and drove to the lake. It was still foggy, the air cool enough to sting. I sat on a bench with my coffee, watching the water ripple. Somewhere across the city, Mom was probably pacing her kitchen, and Grace was scrolling through her phone, still trying to control the story. But here, none of that mattered. I thought about the years I'd spent chasing approval, working overtime, staying quiet, apologizing for being ambitious. I thought about every time Mom had said, "You're too much," and every time I'd tried to be less. And I realized maybe revenge wasn't about payback at all. Maybe it was just about reclaiming the space you were never allowed to fill. When I got back to the studio, a small envelope was waiting by the door. My name handwritten in familiar cursive. Inside was a note from Nora. "You've made your point. We're done talking about this. I hope someday you realize what you've cost this family. No signature, no love, just distance." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and dropped it in the trash. Some things didn't need to be kept. That night I stayed late at the studio, cleaning up after the last class. The air was still warm from the ovens. I turned off the lights one by one until only the glow from the front window remained. The street outside was quiet, empty, except for the reflection of my name on the glass bread and balance. For years I'd let other people define who I was. Now it was just me, my name, my work, my peace. I locked the door and stood for a moment, looking at the sign before turning to leave. The city hummed softly in the distance, and for once the sound didn't make me feel small. It made me feel alive. Back home, I poured a glass of wine and opened my notebook. I wrote one sentence before closing it again. "Justice doesn't always taste sweet, but it always fills you." I leaned back, listening to the faint rain outside, and smiled. The world didn't owe me peace. I had baked my own. 3 days after the bakery's final closure, a letter arrived at my apartment. Not from lawyers this time, no logos, no formal headers, just an envelope with my name written in neat cursive. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My mother. For a long time, I stood by the window, turning the envelope over in my hands. The morning light cut through the blinds in sharp lines across the paper, making the ink shimmer faintly. I thought about throwing it away, but curiosity, or maybe habit, won. Inside was a single page folded perfectly in thirds. "Lydia, you've embarrassed this family beyond words. Grace may never recover from what you've done. You've proven that spite will always outweigh love in your heart. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you for this. Please don't contact us. Mom." No love, no warmth, Just her name, Nora, cold as the rain tapping against the glass. I read it twice, then placed it on the counter beside my coffee mug. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. It was as if she'd finally said out loud what I'd always known. I had stopped being her daughter the moment I stopped being obedient. By the time I got to the studio, Maggie was already there. She took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" I handed her the letter. She read it silently, then folded it back with shaking hands. "Wow," she said finally. "That woman could turn guilt into a weapon." I laughed, but it came out hollow. She's always been fluent in it. "You okay?" she asked softly. "I think so," I said. "It hurts, but it's clean. Like pulling out a splinter." Maggie reached across the table, her voice steady. "You don't owe her an apology for setting yourself free." I nodded, but my throat felt tight. That afternoon, I kept myself busy with the new workshop group, 5 strangers, who didn't know anything about me beyond the smell of bread and the warmth of my smile. Teaching them helped, watching their hands move through the dough, their laughter breaking the silence. It reminded me that creation could still heal. During cleanup June, the older woman who'd brought her granddaughter before lingered again. She watched me fold a towel, then said quietly, "Family can break you, can't it?" I met her gaze. "Sometimes," I said. "But sometimes it's what you build after they break you that saves you." She smiled faintly. "Then you're saving yourself beautifully." After she left, I sat by the window and watched the light fade from the city. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening like glass. For a long time, I just breathed. That night I dreamed of the bakery, not the chaos or the betrayal, but the earliest days. My father's laughter echoing off the tiled walls, flour dusting the air like snow. Grace at 12 years old, trying to sneak cookie dough when she thought no one was watching. I woke up with tears on my pillow. The next morning there was another knock at my door. When I opened it, my father was standing there holding a grocery bag like a peace offering. "Your mother said you might not be eating properly," he said awkwardly. I stepped aside, letting him in. "She says a lot of things." He set the bag down, fruit bread milk inside. "Grace is upset. I'm aware. She says you canceled everything." "I canceled what was mine," I said. He rubbed his temple, his voice low. "Lydia, I know you feel wronged, but this is too much." "Too much," I repeated. "She took my bakery, Dad, my brand, my work, my dream, and you both stood by her while she did it." His shoulders slumped. "You know how your mother gets." "I didn't want to make it worse." "You didn't make it better either," I said. "You just watched." He winced, looking down. "You've always been the strong one. We thought you could handle things." "That's not strength," I said quietly. "That's survival. And I'm tired of surviving for people who wouldn't do the same for me." He didn't answer. The silence stretched between us like an old wound. Finally he said, "You're still my daughter. I hate seeing you like this." "I'm fine," I said, and for once I meant it. He nodded slowly, uncertain. "Your mother won't admit it, but she's scared. Not of you, of losing control. She doesn't know how to love what she can't manage." That made something in me ache because it was true. He hesitated at the door. "If you ever want to talk, you know where to find me." "I do," I said, "and I hope one day you find yourself too." After he left, I leaned my forehead against the door and exhaled. The apartment was quiet again, but not empty. I felt lighter. Maybe because for the first time I didn't need his approval to feel whole. That evening I walked to the lakefront. The water rippled gently, the reflection of city lights flickering like candle flames. I sat on the same bench where I'd gone weeks ago, when everything first fell apart. Back then I'd been angry, trembling, desperate to be seen. Now I just felt still. A couple strolled by hand in hand, their laughter drifting across the water. I smiled faintly. For years I'd believed peace was something other people had, people with uncomplicated lives, tidy families, happy endings. But maybe peace wasn't a gift. Maybe it was a decision. When I got home, a text was waiting on my phone. Unknown number. "You think this makes you better than us? Enjoy your little empire, Lydia." It won't last forever. Grace. I stared at the message for a while, then deleted it. No anger, no reply, just silence. The next morning, I opened the studio early. I brewed coffee, arranged fresh flowers on the counter, and turned on the soft jazz playlist I always used when I needed calm. The space filled with light, warm and golden. As I kneaded dough for the morning's batch, I thought about everything I'd lost and how much more I'd gained in its place. No family photos on the wall, no shared name on the storefront. Just me, my work, my truth. When the timer dinged, I pulled the bread from the oven and placed it on the rack. The crust crackled softly in the quiet room, and for a moment it sounded like applause. I smiled, whispering, "Here's to balance." Outside, the city was waking up. Somewhere across town, Mom was probably pacing, Grace was probably posting, and Dad was probably pretending everything was fine. But none of that belonged to me anymore. What belonged to me was here: the smell of bread, the glow of morning light, the steady heartbeat of something I'd built with my own hands. I didn't need forgiveness. I didn't need validation. I just needed this. And as I sat there sipping coffee in the golden silence, I realized something simple and true. Peace doesn't ask for permission. It just shows up when you stop begging for it. The article came out on a Tuesday morning. I hadn't known they were publishing it yet, but the subject line of Maria's email gave it away. "You're on the front page." I clicked the link, and there it was, my name in bold letters across a glossy art magazine, followed by a headline that made my stomach twist. "The Woman Who Turned Betrayal into Bread." The piece was surprisingly kind, describing my workshops as a healing space built from ashes. It called my story an intimate reflection on family forgiveness and the price of freedom. But even as I read the words, I knew what would happen next. Praise traveled slower than outrage, but it always found its way home. By noon, my mother had left a voicemail. Her tone was clipped cold, rehearsed. "You've humiliated us again," she said. "Now the whole world knows our private affairs." "How could you?" I didn't respond. I just sat at my kitchen table, the phone on speaker, listening, until her voice dissolved into static. An hour later, a text came from Grace. "You really built a career off destroying me. Congrats." I typed out a dozen replies before deleting them all. Instead, I went for a walk. The city was washed clean from last night's rain. The air smelled like earth and sugar from the nearby cafe. As I walked, I thought about how strange it felt to be both the villain and the survivor in everyone's story. In my mother's eyes, I'd burned the family name. To strangers, I was the woman who got her revenge and somehow made it poetic. But the truth was simpler than that. I hadn't sought revenge. I'd sought balance. When I got back to the studio, the phone was ringing again. It was Maria. "You've seen it, right?" she said breathlessly. "It's everywhere. You're trending on art blogs, Lydia. People love the way you've woven pain into something creative." I smiled faintly. "I guess destruction photographs well." "Don't say that," she said quickly. "This isn't destruction, it's transformation. You've taken something toxic and made it honest." Honest. That word landed hard. After we hung up, I stood by the front window watching people pass by. Some glanced at the sign, curious. Others came in to ask about the next class. A few looked at me like they recognized my face. Fame was supposed to feel bright, but it felt like standing under a harsh light with no shadows to hide in. By late afternoon, I decided to take a drive. The rain had started again, thin and steady, the kind that softened everything it touched. I drove past the old bakery building. The windows were still bare, the for-lease sign crooked. It looked smaller than I remembered, like a ghost of something that once mattered too much. I parked for a minute, watching through the drizzle. A couple walked by, peering in, as if imagining what it used to be. They kept going. The city had already moved on. That night, Ethan showed up at my door with dinner. "You're famous," he said, setting down 2 takeout boxes. "I'm infamous," I corrected. He grinned. "You're both. It's a rare talent." We sat on the couch, eating quietly. He kept watching me between bites. "You don't look happy," he said finally. "I don't know what I look like anymore," I admitted. "Everyone keeps telling me how strong I am, how brave. But I don't feel brave. I just feel done." "Done can be good," he said. "Done means you've stopped bleeding." I leaned back, closing my eyes. "Then, why does it still ache?" He didn't answer. He just reached over and took my hand. We sat like that for a long time, the silence gentle, not empty. When he left, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at the window. The city lights shimmered through the rain like reflections on glass. I could see my own face faintly in the window, older, steadier, not broken, but changed. The next morning, I woke to another email. This one wasn't from a stranger or a magazine. It was from my father. The subject line read, "Your sister isn't doing well." For a long time, I didn't open it. I didn't want to know. But curiosity won. "Lydia," it began. "Grace has been staying with us. She's not sleeping, not eating much. I think she feels lost. She won't say it, but she's been reading the things written about you. Maybe you should call her." I read it twice, then closed the laptop. Not yet. That afternoon, I met Maria at the gallery to finalize an upcoming exhibit, a collaboration between artists who'd built something from personal loss. The space smelled like paint and dust. Rows of white walls waited for color. Maria walked beside me, clipboard in hand. "You know, Lydia," she said, "it's not the story that makes people care. It's the honesty. Most artists hide behind their work. You let yours stare back." I smiled. "I guess I ran out of things to hide behind." She looked at me, eyes kind. "That's why people connect with you. You remind them they're allowed to survive." After she left, I lingered alone in the gallery. The air was still thick with anticipation. I imagined my photographs hanging here someday, pictures of hands covered in flower faces, lit by ovens, quiet moments of resilience. Not revenge, just truth. That evening, I went home and sat in the dark, the glow from the streetlights spilling across the floor. My phone buzzed again. "Grace." I hesitated, then answered. Her voice was fragile, frayed at the edges. "I knew you'd call," she said. "I wasn't going to," I admitted. "Dad emailed me." She gave a soft, humorless laugh. "Of course he did. Always the messenger." There was a long pause. I could hear faint music in the background, the kind you play when you don't want to be alone with your thoughts. "I saw the article," she said finally. "They made you sound like some kind of saint, the brave artist who found redemption through pain." "I didn't write it," I said. "But you lived it," she shot back. "And now I'm the villain in your story. You made yourself the villain when you took my bakery." "You could have just said no, Lydia," she said, her voice breaking. "You didn't have to destroy everything." "I did say no," I said quietly. "You just never listened." Silence filled the line, heavy and uneven. I thought she might hang up, but then she whispered, "I don't hate you. I just don't know how to forgive you." "You don't have to," I said. "Just stop pretending I don't exist." There was another pause. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller. "Mom's sick of talking about it. Dad's pretending it's fine. And me, I can't go anywhere without people asking about you. You didn't want fame, Lydia. But you got it anyway." "I didn't want fame," I said. "I wanted peace." She exhaled shakily. "You always make everything sound so noble." "No," I said softly. "Just honest." We sat in silence for a long moment before she said, "I don't know who I am without the bakery." "Then, maybe it's time to find out," I said. "You might like who you meet." When the call ended, I sat there staring at the dark window, the city lights flickering like tiny fires. For the first time, I didn't feel angry at her. I just felt sad for both of us. Later that night, I opened my laptop again and reread my father's email. At the end, there was a blurry photo attached, Grace sitting on the porch at their house, her head tilted toward the light. It wasn't staged. It was real. For a moment, I saw what I'd been trying to capture in my art, all along the truth that exists in the unguarded spaces between pain and forgiveness. I closed the laptop and whispered to the quiet room. Maybe that's where we start again. Outside, the rain had stopped. The moonlight spilled through the glass, soft and silver like forgiveness pretending to be light. The night was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the wall clock. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the letter in my hands. It was the one my father had left on my doorstep that morning, a cream envelope with my name written in the looping, careful handwriting he always used when he wanted to say something important. I had read the first half before work but hadn't finished. Now, as midnight stretched thin around me, I opened it again. The paper trembled slightly between my fingers. If you ever forget who you are, bake something. The smell will remind you of home even when home forgets you. I blinked, and for a moment the letters blurred. My throat tightened. That was something he'd said to me when I was a kid, standing on a stool beside him while we kneaded dough until our arms ached. I could almost hear his voice again, warm and steady, humming along to the old radio. For a long time I just sat there in the quiet, letting the memory wash over me. Then I got up, went to the pantry, and pulled out the flour, sugar, and yeast. I didn't follow a recipe. I didn't measure. I just baked. The kitchen filled with the scent of warm bread, that same scent that had carried me through grief, betrayal, and every silent war I'd fought in that house. When the timer dinged, I pulled the loaf out, steam curling toward the ceiling, and thought, this is what survival smells like. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the window like forgiveness. I packed a slice of the bread in a paper bag and drove to the studio. I had a full class that day, but before anyone arrived, I sat at one of the wooden tables and took a bite. It tasted simple, imperfect, real. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was eating alone. By mid-morning, the door opened and my mother stepped inside. I hadn't seen her since the day she called me cruel. She looked smaller somehow, her hair pulled back neatly, a pale pink scarf around her neck. She hesitated in the doorway like a stranger who wasn't sure she was allowed in. I didn't know you taught classes here, she said softly. I didn't know you still wanted to see me, I replied. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the racks of fresh bread and the soft light filtering through the windows. It's beautiful, she said finally. You've built something good. I crossed my arms. You mean something without you. Her lips pressed together, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small parcel wrapped in parchment. I brought this, she said. I tried to bake. It's awful, but I wanted to show you I remembered his recipe. I unwrapped it and smiled, despite myself. The loaf was uneven, edges burnt, but the effort was honest. He would have loved this, I said. She nodded, her eyes glistening. You look like him when you smile. I swallowed hard. You used to say I was too much like him. I was scared of that, she admitted. Scared of how much he loved you and how much I envied it. The air between us felt fragile like glass that might crack if either of us moved too quickly. She reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly. I don't expect forgiveness, she said. I just wanted to tell you I was wrong. About the bakery, about Grace, about you. I stared at her hand for a long moment before placing mine on top of it. We all burned something we loved, I said quietly. At least we can start again. She smiled through her tears. Maybe we can. We sat there for a while, eating slices of the burnt bread. It was dry and bitter, but we both laughed anyway. Somehow it tasted like healing. That evening after my mother left, I pulled out an old wooden box I hadn't opened in years. It was my father's, a collection of handwritten recipes, notes, and scraps of ideas he'd jotted down over decades. The paper smelled faintly of cinnamon and thyme. As I flipped through them, I found one sheet that made me stop. In his messy script, it read for Lydia. When the world feels too heavy, feed it something warm. I smiled, blinking back tears. Then I knew what I needed to do. I spent the next few hours scanning every page, digitizing his recipes. By midnight, I had an idea, a website, a community project, Harold's Hands, a digital archive of his recipes open to anyone who wanted to learn, a way to share what he'd given me without selling it, without ownership or profit, just love. Elliot, my old friend from culinary school, helped me design the page. Maggie wrote the introduction. Some recipes aren't meant to be owned, they're meant to be shared. When it came time to write my own note for the site, I paused for a long time, staring at the blinking cursor before typing. This is for my father, who taught me that real ownership isn't what you keep, it's what you pass on. When I hit publish, the screen glowed soft blue, and for a second I swore I felt him there beside me. Later that night, the studio was dark except for the light from the oven. The air smelled like flour and sugar. I closed my eyes, and in the hush of that moment, I could almost hear his voice. "Took you long enough to rise, my little chef." I smiled, whispering back the dough needed time. The warmth from the oven wrapped around me like an embrace. It wasn't revenge that had carried me here, it was balance. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at one of the tables looking around the studio. Every scar on the wooden counter, every fleck of flour in the air felt sacred. I thought about how much I'd lost and how much I'd found in return. The bakery was gone. The family name fractured, but the truth, the one I'd spent years trying to prove, stood quietly in front of me. I had always been enough. Before going to bed, I opened my father's letter one last time. At the bottom, in smaller handwriting, almost an afterthought, was a final line I hadn't noticed before. If you ever wonder whether you did the right thing, ask yourself if it brought you peace. If it did, that's all the answer you need. I read it again, slower this time. Then I folded the letter, pressed it to my chest, and whispered, "It did." Outside, the wind brushed softly against the window. The city was sleeping. I turned off the oven, set the loaf on the counter to cool, and walked to my room. For the first time in years, I slept without guilt, without the weight of proving myself. I dreamed of the old kitchen again, of my father's hands, dusted with flour of laughter, echoing through warm light, of the sound of bread cracking as it cooled. In the dream, he looked at me and said, "You did it, kiddo. You found your balance." And I smiled, knowing that maybe, just maybe, he was right. The morning of the gallery opening felt different from any I'd lived before. Quiet, steady, almost weightless. I woke to sunlight crawling gently across the floorboards, warm and golden, the same shade of morning light that used to spill into the bakery when I was a child. Only this time there was no rush, no shouting, no checklist waiting on the counter. Just calm. The exhibit was called Light Again. Maria had insisted on the title. "It's who you are now," she'd said. "You took something broken and turned it into light." By 9, I was standing in front of the tall windows of the downtown gallery. The air inside smelled faintly of paint and freshly cleaned wood. My photographs lined the white walls, each one a small piece of the journey I'd fought through. Hands covered in flour, empty chairs. My self-portrait from the night of the bakery's closure, eyes swollen but steady. As guests began to arrive, I stayed near the entrance, greeting them with a smile that didn't feel forced for once. They wandered slowly through the exhibit, pausing in front of each photo, whispering softly to one another. Some smiled, others stood completely still. I watched them and realized that for the first time, people weren't seeing my pain as gossip. They were seeing it as truth. A woman in her 60s approached me. She wore a floral scarf and carried herself with the careful posture of someone who had lived through her own storms. "You took these?" she asked. I did. She looked at one photograph, 2 loaves of bread cooling on a cracked counter, and said quietly, "They're painful, but beautiful." "Pain can be beautiful," I said. "If it stops hiding," she nodded, eyes glistening. "I know what it feels like to be uninvited." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I reached out, touched her hand gently, and said, "Then, you know what it means to walk into your own story." She smiled, and for a brief moment it felt like we understood each other without needing to say anything else. Halfway through the evening, Maria found me by the refreshment table. "Someone's here asking for you," she whispered. Older woman, pearl earrings. My stomach tightened. "Mom." Maria's eyes widened. "Do you want me to know?" I said, taking a breath. "It's fine." I turned, and there she was, standing near the far wall, immaculate, as ever in her beige coat and polished shoes, her expression unreadable. She was studying a photo of me sitting on the floor of my studio camera beside me, eyes red, shoulders straight. The title under it read Balance. I walked toward her slowly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "So, it's true," she said at last. "You've turned our family into a spectacle. It's not about you," I said evenly. "It's about what you taught me to hide." Her eyes flicked toward me. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? People are talking." "They've always talked," I said. "I just stopped trying to please them." Her lips pressed together. For the first time, she looked unsure. "You think this makes you strong. It makes you cruel." "Maybe," I said quietly, "but at least I'm not silent." She looked back at the photograph of me on the floor. "You look small," she murmured. "I was," I said, "because I was still trying to fit into a picture you approved of." Something flickered in her eyes, pain or regret, I couldn't tell. "Grace doesn't deserve what you did," she said finally. "She deserved honesty," I said. So did I. We stood in silence. For once she didn't lecture, didn't twist the story to fit her comfort. She just looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the faintest crack in the marble mask she'd worn all my life. From across the room, Maria's voice called, "Lydia, can we get a photo with you by your piece?" I turned back to my mother. "You don't have to understand it," I said. "You just have to let it exist." She didn't answer. She just stepped back slightly, eyes darting to the side as if she couldn't bear the weight of all those truths on the walls. When the flash went off, I smiled. Not the polite smile I'd worn for years at family dinners, but something smaller, steadier, mine. By the time I turned back, she was gone. That night after the gallery closed, Maria handed me a glass of champagne. "To starting over," she said. I raised my glass. To no longer waiting for permission. The bubbles hissed softly between us, a quiet toast to something neither of us could quite name. The next morning, I woke to a voicemail from my father. His voice was gentle, tired. "I saw the photos online. They're beautiful, Lydia. Your mother's upset, but I think she needed to see them. I'm proud of you. Call me when you can." I listened to it twice before deleting it. Some words were better kept as echoes. Later that week, Maria called again. "You won't believe this," she said. "A magazine in New York wants to feature Light again. They said it captures modern family dynamics, raw, vulnerable, unapologetic." I laughed softly. "Of course they did. This could change your career," she said. I looked around my studio. The walls were bare again, waiting for something new. "I'm not sure I want to chase careers anymore," I said. "I just want to keep telling the truth." "Then keep doing that," Maria said. "The world's listening now." That afternoon, I went for a walk by the river. The air was cool and sharp, the water glinting in the sunday. I carried my camera, though I wasn't sure what I wanted to capture. Then I saw it, a small child feeding pigeons by the pier, laughing as the birds fluttered around her. The light caught her face just right, pure and unfiltered. I raised the camera and clicked the shutter. For once, the picture didn't feel like work. It felt like breathing. When I got home, a text was waiting from Grace. I saw the photos. "They're beautiful. Maybe someday you can teach me how to see things the way you do." I stared at it for a long time before typing back, "You already can. You just have to stop looking through Mom's lens." No drama, no speeches, just honesty. That evening, Ethan came over with flowers, sunflowers this time, bright and open. For the famous artist, he teased setting them on the counter. "I'm not famous," I said. "You are," he said, smiling. "At least to the right people." We sat by the window watching the sunset spill gold across the lake. He turned to me. "So what's next?" I thought for a moment. "Maybe teaching," I said. "Helping other photographers tell their stories. The ones they've been too afraid to frame." He nodded. "You'd be good at that." I smiled. "I just want to remind people that truth doesn't always look perfect. Sometimes it looks like survival." He leaned closer. "That's your next headline." We laughed, and the sound felt easy, unforced. Outside, the city lights began to flicker one by one, reflections rippling across the water. As the night deepened, I took out my camera again. I pointed it toward the balcony where the city glowed beneath a soft haze. The frame caught a slice of sky, a corner of light, and the faint reflection of two figures sitting close. I pressed the shutter. When I looked at the screen, I smiled. It wasn't perfect, it was real. Before bed, I stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cool, the smell of rain faint in the distance. I thought about everything that had led me here. The betrayal, the silence, the rebuilding the light. For years I had been the daughter. Silence, the sister erased, the woman told she was too much. Now I was the storyteller, the artist, the proof that light doesn't ask permission to exist. I lifted my camera one last time and whispered to the night. If you've ever been uninvited, remember you don't need a door to walk into your own story. The shutter clicked softly. And for the first time I knew the sound wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of my light. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to fight for your own glow. Because if you have, you already know your light was never theirs to take.